And we are back with the power rankings heading into the final online major of the CDL season. Thank goodness, man, we're almost back to land. But my word, we did a power rankings video pretty recently, but man, so much has changed in the short few weeks since the last power rankings video. So today we are talking about it all. There are some spicy teams we gotta discuss and sort these guys out. So without further ado, guys, let's get right into this one. Let's go. Alrighty, so you know how this goes. We got the 4 tiers. We got the needs work tier, the in the mix tier, the contenders tier, and the elite tier. We'll be sorting all 12 teams through these tiers and see where they end up sorting out here. So it's definitely going to get mixy. It's going to get interesting. So with that said, we can start it off here. And at number 12 at the back here in the needs work category, we've got the Seattle Surge, man. It has been a disappointing spur of a few weeks for the Surge, and it's basically has gotten worse and worse. They dropped Looney, of course, for Decimate. We talked a lot about this team yesterday in the breakdown video, which I highly recommend to go check out because we really dove into this past weekend there. But man, the Surge, it was tough, and they are now on a 6 series losing streak. Of course, the narrative going into these past few weeks was, okay, they haven't really played any bad teams recently, so they should be out here and they're going to beat the teams that they should beat, but they're going to struggle beating the teams in the top 4, top 5. But my word, the London series was a pretty massive awakening here for Seattle, a little slap to the face, because they got full on smoked. It wasn't close, and that's where the worries start really seeping in. Of course, London, we'll talk about here in a little bit, they have had a lot of improvement and they've looked significantly better lately. But man, for Seattle to get out there and nearly get 100-point clubbed in both respawns, it was really close in the first respawn on Moscow, where they were in dangerous 100-point club territory. And then on the Garrison, they actually got 100-point clubbed. And you look at the control, it was just an ugly series as a whole, and they still end up losing. Just defensive wins on Garrison, so nothing too impressive on the offensive side for them. And you saw how frustrated Priestahh looked after that series. It was tough. And so bringing in Decimate, you hoped you'd see that slaying upside, which we talked about yesterday in the video, which again, go check out. But we haven't seen that flash from him yet, even though he's looked solid. But that's not what this team needed. This team needed more than just solid, because Looney was at many times solid as well. There's a lot of problems here. There's a lot of actual team player by player situational issues here, especially just really across all 3 game modes. In respawns right now, it's just a big worry. And so with that said, Seattle's at 12, and there are some real question marks for this team. Alrighty, so at number 11, we got another team here that's just, they need a little bit more work, but we've seen some of these moments where they've looked solid, but 3 of their 5 wins this season are against the Florida Mutineers, and that's the Paris Legion. So they have really struggled when not playing Florida recently. They got 3-0'd by the Ultra. They beat the Mutineers, though. They got 3-1 by the Rokkr, 3-0'd by the Guerillas, 3-1'd by the Legion during this stage. They've had some struggles, and again, after bringing in Temp, dropping fire for Temp, you were hoping to see a little bit more consistency through all the game modes, which they still look competitive in, but it's hard to say that there's that much improvement after dropping fire for Temp when it comes to slaying. You're hoping the roles might fall into place a little bit better with Skrapz and with Temp and how that would play with the Flex and a main SMG. But they've gone back and forth about that and really haven't been able to figure it out either. Even though Temp against Florida looked really good, especially on that 4th Moscow map, on the Moscow hardpoint, where Temp was going off and looking really nice. Besides that, against other teams like LAG, Ultra, it just was a really weird series, considering the Garrison hardpoint went the distance and ended up going to time. So they looked really competitive. And so I could see the argument for them being in the mixed tier, but I'm going to keep them in the needs work tier. But they're a team just like London in our last power rankings, where I said they've shown the potential to end up being in the mixed tier, or maybe pushing up towards a contender type team. They're right there, but that's why I have them at the top of the needs work tier, like right around here or so, where there is a gap right now between Paris and Seattle, where Seattle is pretty far and away the worst team in the CDL right now. The next team on the list here gets a little bit interesting as well after their somewhat recent roster change. The difference here is the game 5s recently have been really tough for the LA Guerillas after bringing in Chino. They've lost their last 3 series in game 5s in S&Ds. And it's just been a frustrating go for them against the Empire, against the Rokkr, against the Mutineers. And this is where the whole situation is right there. They're in the mixed tier, right in the middle there. This is where things get pretty interesting. There are basically 10 teams in the CDL who are very, very competitive with all the teams. When you look at across the board, all right, can LAG make it a difficult series for any of these remaining 9 teams? Yes, they definitely can. And we have seen that with, again, the Rokkr, the Empire, and the Mutineers, but they just cannot get over that hump. Whether it's an S&D that comes back to bite them or it's a respawn, there's just a lot of question marks with this squad. I mean, the Rokkr series, like where we saw on the checkmate hardpoint, Apathy was looking incredible, just so good. I mean, we talked a lot about this on the podcast and recently in breakdown videos or whatever it is, but since they brought in Chino, the big question mark for me was, can Silly be the great second SMG for this team? Where I thought he looked really good as a flex using the Krig, and it just has not been great. I mean, it's just, again, really inconsistent for Silly, where you see a few moments you're like, wow, that was great. And you see those flashes of really nice twitchy plays that he makes. It just doesn't feel like he's a main SMG. It just very rarely gives you that vibe that he's comfortable playing that role. I'm just not confident enough in this squad to put them above many of these other teams that have shown a little bit more upside as a whole. And against Florida, I really thought they had a great chance to win that game 5. It was on Moscow, where really LAG's looked very good lately, and Florida just countered most of their strats, caught on to a lot of their tendencies, although they did not catch on to their fake B rotate A strat that LAG continues to perfect. But at the same point, it's like, man, if you're just seeing no consistency in the respawns, where they've been taking the hard points in map 4, which has been impressive and nice that they've been able to do that against Rokkr and against the Mutineers. Against Dallas, they took the map 2, the map 3, the S&D, and then the control. They just have not been able to clutch up in 2 S&Ds, and so it's like, all right, they can be competitive on certain maps in certain modes, but the consistency is nowhere to be found with this team. And we've seen them now be competitive against the Empire, the Rokkr, and Florida, who are just realistically now middling teams in the CDL. And so it's hard to justify putting them higher than about, you know, 10th, 9th right now. And that's where we're sitting. So the other team that gets interesting though, and I could see the argument for having LAG ahead of them, would be the London Royal Ravens, who we have basically right next to them here. I'll move them over just a little bit. Right next to them in the mix category as well. Obviously, London took the Seattle Surge to the shed and absolutely beat them down in their series. I mean, looking fantastic in both hardpoints. Again, the Surge have been struggling significantly, so that there is the argument there that the Surge are just really bad right now, and that's fair. But if you look at their previous 2 series as well, they took FaZe to a game 5, winning the map 1 hardpoint and the control on Garrison, which is not easy to win against FaZe. And you've seen Zaptius really start coming into his own here as an SMG that they needed him to be. And Paul continues to be so reliable. Shawnee's so reliable. And Zed continues to bring the energy. I really like their listenings as well. I feel like we've seen a lot of improvement with the communication with this team and the comfort that they have with each other. And then, of course, they beat the Subliners in a game 5 in a really impressive series where they won both S&Ds. They took the control as well on Checkmate. So far, Checkmate, or control as a whole, has been London's greatest asset, and they've looked very good. And so it wouldn't be surprising if they can make some noise here in the major, and we'll just have to see how it ends up playing out. But Paris is one to keep your eye on, as definitely a dark horse moving into the major, and we'll just have to see. I really like the direction this team is headed, and I think they have a lot of upside still baked into this team moving into the next few weeks as well, heading into LAN and stage 4 as well for the major. So this is a really interesting squad. Keep your eye on them in these next few weeks, because it could be a lot of fun. So now we're heading into the contenders tier. We only have 4 teams in these bottom 2 tiers. Then we have the rest of the teams, the other 8, in these top 2. So the contenders tier is packed. It is an interesting time in the CDL right now. So it felt like a lot of things started falling into place here this past weekend with the matches that we saw for a lot of these contender type teams. And we overall just definitely learned a lot about these squads. At number 8, we have probably the most disappointing team of the whole stage 3, at least for me personally. And that was the Minnesota Rokkr. They really didn't look impressive for most of this stage, and they, in their first series, they end up losing to Florida 3-1. Then they beat the Legion 3-1. They lost to the Ultra 3-1, which, to be fair, they did take the only map off the Ultra this stage. Then they beat the Guerillas 3-2 again in that really, really close series. But that checkmate hardpoint was a real scare for me and like a big red flag for how they played. And they won a Mixie Apocalypse match against LAG, which you'd expect the Rokkr to win. They lost a Moscow S&D, although it was around 11. And so there were just a lot of like, okay, I mean, definitely by no means an impressive win. And then they go in and play the Empire, who hasn't necessarily looked great so far recently, which we've talked a lot about so far in the past week or two. But they end up going down 3-1 to these guys, and Empire took them to the woodshed in the Apocalypse. Empire looked great in that Apocalypse hardpoint in map 4. And man, you know, you watch the Miami S&D and you're like, okay, you know, the Rokkr have been a pretty good S&D team this year, and you'd expect S&D to play to a lot of their strengths. And the Empire just really were impressive in that series as well. And so as a whole, it's like, okay, you know, they're definitely a contender, which is why they have to be in this tier, but you can't be impressed with them or have a lot of confidence in them heading into this major, especially after the recent respawn performances from them against LAG and Empire, losing both respawns against, or losing both hardpoints against Empire, splitting hardpoints with LAG, who has not been a good hardpoint team this year, getting smoked by Toronto. Although, again, winning a raid against Toronto is always impressive, which raid has been, of course, the Rokkr's best hardpoint map, which most reasonably you'll expect teams will veto and force them to play something else. So as a whole, like, yeah, that Miami S&D performance was impressive from the Rokkr there against LAG, where Priestahh had 17 kills, but you just haven't seen that consistency against the better teams and against the teams that you expect to be contenders, and that's been the problem. So I would love to have more confidence in this team, but man, they've been disappointing, and I really thought with Standy they'd turn the corner with a lot of the other maps, but really only raid has been the consistent good performer for them, and besides that, it's been a struggle. So that's what that Rokkr are at number 8. So at number 7, we do have the Dallas Empire, which is also definitely interesting. In our last power rankings, we had them at number 8, and people were a little bit surprised, but they definitely have not been impressive for the most of this stage, and then they finally beat the Rokkr here in their last series of the stage. So the biggest thing that stood out to me for the Empire and the big takeaways was definitely the usage of Illy in this series against the Rokkr. You had to love that Illy was going out there and finding streaks on Moscow, playing really aggressively, snapping on some 3 pieces. He had that flash that we were hoping to see this year from him, and that's definitely exciting for Empire, because that's what they desperately need for him and Shotzzy to be this nasty SMG duo, now that Huke is on LAT Teams, of course. And, you know, the question marks still come from Fellow and from Crim about how consistent they can be. Crim had some really tragic moments, but kept bouncing back in the second half of games. So you like seeing that resiliency from the Empire. And again, that match was so important for seeding in this stage. And so you also like to see that the Empire are clutching up when it matters the most. But man, it's just hard when you look at their stage as a whole. With a win against LAG 3-2, they got 3-0'd by the Mutineers in a really impressive dominant series from the Mutineers. And then they got smoked by the Ultra, although to be fair, some of those maps were pretty close against the Ultra. And then they beat the Legion 3-1. So overall, they went 3-2 in the groups. They look solid, but it came down to me to Florida v Dallas. And then at the end of the day, Florida just beat Dallas 3-0. So how do you not put Florida at least a little bit ahead of them? And then Dallas beat the Rokkr. And so it's like, there is a little bit of a roundabout there, but man, as a whole, you know, I think there's still a lot of upside for this Dallas team, and they can definitely bounce back with Fellow. I don't put it past them to make a run in this stage, but it's hard to see right now with them competing consistently against the best teams, and that's why they're at number 7. So at number 6, we've got the Florida Mutineers. Again, they've been surprisingly impressive after their horrible display against Paris, who just seems to be their kryptonite now. Again, they're 1-3 against Paris this year, with their 2 big losses recently to them. And I love the ice from the Mutineers and the Search and Destroys during these most recent stages, especially on that Moscow against LAG. They looked great on the Express against Dallas, and they took the Moscow off Legion, even though they ended up losing that series with the respawn. So the S&D play is definitely nice. They also took, though they won the Moscow against the Rokkr as well. And so as a whole, they definitely are very, very nice in S&D recently, and that's impressive improvement since bringing in Havoc. You know, the question mark is, of course, the consistency inside of respawns with the really bad, like I mentioned earlier, the Garrison lost to LAG in their most recent series in map 4. And then you look at the Legion series where both respawns in that series were really, really ugly. The loss to the Garrison hardpoint where Legion looked fantastic. Again, Garrison has been traditionally Legion's most competitive map. And then you head into a Moscow hardpoint where the Legion basically just took him to the woodshed again and smoked him there. So the inconsistency is definitely a big worry, but we saw Skies and Awakening look fantastic in these 2 most recent series as a whole. And so you have to have a little bit more confidence in the Mutineers versus the Empire versus the Rokkr after seeing how they performed. And they're another really, really interesting team, man. All of these contender type teams could make some crazy moves in this major, but it's just hard to put your faith in them, and that's why they're in the contenders tier at the end of the day. So at number 5 now, we got OpTic Gaming, bro, and yikes with you. I don't know, bro. It's tough. It's tough. We talked a lot about OpTic yesterday, so I don't want to go on and on since a lot of you guys have already heard this, but the performance from OpTic has to be very, very worrying. And the respawns have been tragic. They have been horrible. Obviously, getting 3-0'd by FaZe. Again, there was the whole the connection discussion or debate around their connection supposedly with FaZe having about 20 ping advantage throughout the whole series because the maps were mistakenly held in Atlanta, even though that shouldn't have been the case from the CDL side. Anyway, that's a whole nother side story. So you can only take so much from the FaZe series, knowing that there was a pretty unfair connection. Playing FaZe on a 20-30 ping advantage is definitely a significant advantage. Who loves the Eagle Chow those headies and use those advantages, and they camera better than anybody in the CDL. So it is tough, but I mean, my word, those respawns weren't even close. I mean, it was absolute destruction. 100 point clubbed on the raid, and then 3-0'd in the raid control, which was scary stuff from FaZe. And then you look back at OpTic's previous series against Subliners, against LA Thieves. And so when they're losing consistently against all of the top 3 teams or top 4 teams in the CDL, you can't have a lot of confidence in this team heading into the major. And then now power ranking them, you're like, okay, we've seen the upside. I mean, sure, they beat the Surge 3-0. They beat London in what was a pretty solid series as well. Where is this team really? It's really, really tough to pin down. And so you go back to the major where, you know, they lost to the Rokkr, they beat the Surge, they lost to Ultra. At the end of the day, their Search and Destroy has looked better and definitely improved during this stage where they beat the Thieves on Express, they beat the Surge, they beat London in S&Ds, but then they lose the S&Ds to both the Subliners and FaZe. So at the end of the day, the OpTic definitely needs to be near the top of the contenders tier, but I don't think you can crown them as an elite team right now, especially after their performances against these other top teams in the CDL. So now at number 4, we had a pretty tough debate whether or not LA Thieves should be in the contenders tier or the elite tier. And I was going back and forth on this. And at the end of the day, I think there's a pretty solid tier gap between the top 3 and then the rest. So at the end of the day, I put the LA Thieves in the contenders tier. This is coming off of losses 3-2 to FaZe and a 3-1 to the Subliners. So they were close. And of course, they're bringing in Huke, and that's probably why. So if we saw a little bit more of Huke before the changes, I might be willing to put them in the elite tier. But because Huke's debut is against the Subliners, and it puts them in a tough spot to really judge where they're at as a squad, that's why I'm not willing to crown them as an elite team just yet, even though they have the potential to do that for sure. So obviously, you know, they got 100 point club in that first Garrison against the Subliners, which was really, really tough. I mean, that was a tough L to take. And they come out, look more competitive after that in the series for sure, winning a really, really, really scrappy raid control. So as a whole, could this team make a run at the major? For sure, but it's hard to put them in the elite category right now. I'm looking at 3 real true contenders for this major right now. And you know who those 3 teams are, and we're about to talk about them right now. So New York Subliners are here in the middle of the elite tier. I kind of wanted to put like a visual gap between the top 3 and the rest, and that's why they're kind of near the middle here. They are at number 3. And again, man, we've seen so much impressive play from this team. Of course, inside of the hardpoints especially. They are 9-0 in hardpoint since Hydra joined the squad. Hydra has been an absolute unit inside of hardpoints. And like I tweeted and I talked about yesterday in the video, when they start winning these search and destroys like they have been, that's where it starts to get a little bit scary for the rest of the CDL, because if they can win these search and destroys, they become a really, really scary team, pairing it with their hardpoint right now, where they look like probably the best hardpoint team in the CDL. I mean, it's either them, FaZe, or Toronto. And we are talking about all of them right here. And they've just been really, really impressive. So in stage 2, they beat FaZe 3-2. They lost to the Ravens 3-2, which is the blemish on their record here. Then they beat the Surge 3-0. Then they beat OpTic 3-1. And then they beat the Thieves 3-1 as well. So again, besides the tough London loss, which, I mean, it's hard to explain that one. They won both hard points, but they lost the S&Ds. They lost the controls. So London won a 2-3-5 series, which is the way to beat the Subliners right now. It's tough. So that's why I have them in just a wee bit behind these other two teams, is because when we most recently saw them, even though they recently beat FaZe, the loss to London's tough, and they beat LA Thieves, they beat OpTic, so they did what they needed to do. They looked really, really good in those series. They are most definitely a contender to win this stage 3 major, and it's gonna depend how it ends up playing out with matchups. And it is going to be an interesting bracket we'll talk about tomorrow on the podcast for sure. But man, New York is a really, really fun team, and there is a definitive top 3 teams in the CDL right now, and they are just a smidge behind the other two, especially realistically. Why? It's because of the balance in game modes, where I just have a little bit more trust in Toronto and in FaZe in controls, and probably for sure Toronto. FaZe is still a question mark with search and destroys, and as a whole, you just gotta trust them in the big moments as well with FaZe. And then Toronto has just continually proved it, and when they've only dropped one map in stage 3, it's hard not to put them near the top here. So now the debate becomes, do I have Atlanta FaZe or Toronto as the top team in the CDL? And let me tell you, I had a ton of debate about this, and it is a really, really difficult question to ask, of course, because they were at the top of each division, and we haven't seen them since they last played, of course, at the stage 2 major, where FaZe ended up going down to the hands of Toronto in the grand finals. It gets tough. So let's play this out before we kind of reveal the rankings here. So obviously the first debate is, how do you feel about these teams in each division? So you do have to wait a little bit. Which division do you feel like is more impressive? And you've got to be inclined to say that, the group B was more impressive with FaZe, with New York, with OpTic, with LA Thieves in that division. And so you have to weight the performances of FaZe against those teams versus the performances of Toronto versus teams like the Legion, LAG, the Mutineers, Empire, and Rokkr, Guerillas. So it is a little bit tough to kind of wait and figure out and sift through the information there. But again, Toronto did everything you'd expect them to do. They dominated their group. It wasn't even close. And it's a really interesting narrative, because it feels like Toronto did exactly what FaZe did in stage 2. Dominate their group. By far the best team in their group. And then you come to the major, and now the question is, how deep of a map pool do you have? And in a grand final, let's say they play FaZe, can you win that grand final against FaZe with the map pools? And how will that play out in a best of 9 series? And that's what gets very, very interesting to me. It's gonna be a crazy tough debate. I really have no problem. It's neck and neck between these two teams, 51-49 about who's the better team right now. And we're gonna have to wait and see what happens at the major. But my inclination is to believe that the Atlanta FaZe are the slightly better team. So I'm going to go with Toronto at 2, Atlanta FaZe at 1. And believe the hype on Atlanta FaZe. And the argument here comes from that they've been developing their map pool throughout the stage. They've worked very hard on developing their map pool, where Toronto, they've been through the grinder. They have played a pretty good map pool throughout the stage. Look at, they played 4 of the 5 hard points, and they put out great performances in search and destroy. But again, they were beating teams so bad, they only ended up having to play 5 S&Ds throughout the stage. And they played 4 of the 5 S&D maps, and they won all 4 as well. So you know, those are the debates with the Ultra versus with FaZe. And then you have to come down to, okay, who has a better map pool in across all game modes, across all maps. What I really respect about how FaZe approached this stage is that I think they were really trying to address the major flaws that Ultra exposed in the grand finals against them about their lack of search and destroy and their map pool. And I think we've seen major improvement within S&D with this FaZe team, where they played very, very well across the whole stage, losing basically just 2 S&Ds throughout the stage. 1 to the LA Thieves, they lost on Express, and then they lost a raid in round 11 to the Subliners, which FaZe had every chance to win that one. So at the end of the day, it comes down to hardpoint v hardpoints, basically a 50-50 tie. You probably favor, in my opinion, I would still favor FaZe now that FaZe isn't going to be underestimating the Ultra in any sense next time they play. You can play those narratives. I don't necessarily love playing those narratives, but at the same time, there's not too much other evidence to go off of in head-to-head besides the 1 series they've had, or the 2 series they've had where FaZe won 1, and then Ultra win the grand finals in the bigger map set, the bigger series. But again, those are on maps that you had to replay after they played against in the I guess the winners finals. So long story short, I'm rambling at this point, but it's very, very interesting between these 2 teams. When you line them up face to face, it's incredibly competitive. FaZe has really done an incredible job of rounding their map pool out, and they're gonna be coming into this stage with something to prove. And we'll talk a lot more about FaZe and the Ultra on the podcast tomorrow, and going through all of the bracket predictions as well. It's going to be a ton of fun, man. I'm very much looking forward to it. So I'm gonna stick with FaZe at 1, Ultra at 2, and go from there. And man, it's going to be a wild, wild weekend of matches. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, the power rankings. Drop all your comments down below, your thoughts on some of these teams' placings, where with the Rokkr at 8, Empire 7, the contenders series, the contenders tier is just absolutely packed. Your thoughts on everything as a whole, Ultra versus FaZe, and which team deserves the #1 overall ranking right now, where New York is at on this list, and your thoughts heading into the stage. All of them down below. But as always, guys, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like, comment, subscribe, share the video if you guys really enjoyed it. But as always, I'm your boy, Abezy, and guys, we will see you next time. I'm out.